Hello, you all. Once again, we're back with our conversations around the world today, here from Sao Paulo, Cunha, in the high mountains just beside Paraty. When we go down the hill, down the mountain, we will find the Atlantic Ocean. And at the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in South Africa, we have Morne Mostert, who is a friend, who is a fellow at the Future of Work Global Network, and he has a lot of news for us because he's been moving around, as we can see his LinkedIn profile. How are you, Morne? Thanks for
I'm
receiving us.
Thank you, Volney. It's wonderful to see you as always. I'm doing very well, and greetings from South Africa.
Nice, nice. Of course, we have done already one recording of a conversation. It was very edifying, very enriching because we talked about the mindsets for the
Mm,
executives, and you followed in going deeper into the concepts and the theoretical work that you have done, and you put that into a book. And I have it
that's
here,
right.
and you have it in the right, yeah. And it's just fantastic because as long as we started to adapt ourselves in the management theory, of course, Peter Senge has brought one of the most important concepts, which is the learning organization, with the
Yes.
fifth discipline, one of his bestseller books that went around in the 80s.
Mm,
uh, and since then, we have stressed. I remember also Ari de Gills, and
mm,
there is Charles Handy, who have, and
mm.
also Peter Drucker, the
Yeah.
importance of the learning organization, of adaptation, flexibility, and the way that you learn and you process everything so that you can be an effective leader. And with your book, which I have read already, I've done a lot of, I made a lot of notes. I mean, it's so rich, it's so full of concepts. I mean, you can get one or two and you can stay for a whole week elaborating and working it out. Fantastic. I mean, fantastic. And with it's just so important in our conversation. I want to explore that, the systemic leadership learning,
Yeah.
and how it's one of the key and main roles of the leader of today. I mean, today, the leader that doesn't look in a systemic way and puts himself in the place of the learner, as you
Yeah.
have stressed, because
Yes.
but I want to hear from you. I don't want to explain the book that I read because I got the author with me. So please, please elaborate some of the concepts of the book because it's so enriching, and fantastic, Mornay. Fantastic. Not because you're my friend, but I must speak truthfully, that we we have gone into a period of a desert of ideas, very arid. I mean, people are always ruminating old concepts, old ideas. So what you're bringing is something new, something refreshing, and I want to explore. I will try to just listen now. Please, Morne.
Thank you, Volney. Thank you for the kind words, and it's so lovely to be with you again. And perhaps just as a starting point, our gratitude as those of us who work on ideas to you, Volney, for bringing this work also to the world. Thank you so much for the invitation. And yes, it's been such an exciting journey to work on this book over the last while. And I have to say the interest has been extremely positive. We've launched the book in London, in Dubai with great interest, in Johannesburg. We'll be tomorrow, I think, in a place that you know well, the waterfront in Cape Town, and then later in the year we'll be in Amsterdam as well as in Paris. So the world has shown a lot of curiosity in the book, and I think it is because, as you say, we haven't cracked this. If we look at the world today, it seems fragmented, it seems disjointed. Of course, it's hyper complex. There's a general sense of sort of uncertainty and anxiety. And Volney, I wanted to produce some work that said, how do we help a senior executive in a large global organization to deal with these kinds of challenges? Because you're right, so many ideas are outdated, are simply repeated, and so different from that lush environment in Sao Paulo that's behind you there. We have, as you eloquently said, a sort of desert of ideas. So I wanted to work on a book that helps executives to think about the future. So it's simply entitled Executive Futures. And then I'll talk about the subtitle in a moment, but the tagline, Volney, is the mindsets, the methods, and the madness of becoming a 21st century executive, because that's how so many executives feel today. The complexity they face is so severe, geopolitically, planetary-wise, society-wise, commercially, talent-wise. There are just so many pressures on them. Can we, instead of just accusing them for not dealing with it, can we help them in some way? Can we offer them some support? So executive futures. And then, that tagline of quantum curriculum, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So my main interest, as I do executive development work around the world, is on the mind of the executive. What goes on there? Now, in the sort of mid-90s, we began this emphasis on so-called emotional intelligence with Goldman and others. And emotional intelligence is important, but I would argue, Volney, there's been almost a shift away now from intellectual competence towards a kind of emotional intelligence. And what I'm arguing is that we need, in fact, much more of a balance, but intellectual development has stayed behind. So what do we mean by intellectual development for a senior person? Essentially, both the art, because it is an art, and also a science of thinking, and very importantly then, making decisions. In this hyper-complex world, how do I, as an executive, make decisions? So the book is designed to offer senior people some frameworks and principles for their intellectual development as it relates to their decisions. Now, in terms of the style, Volney, I borrowed heavily, as you saw in the book, from the movies. And I love the movies. And so all the movie titles are, in fact, borrowed from the movies. The first chapter is Dr. Strange and the Multiverse of Madness.
Yeah.
Then Everything Everywhere All at Once, Oppenheimer, The Big Short, Guardians of the Galaxy, and so it goes, Whiplash, The Fugitive. And then I played with some of the chapters' names here and there. In chapter 7, for example, there's a subsection called The Fast and the Curious, to just poke fun at the movie titles. And the reason I did that, Volney, is that when you look at futures science and you look at the concept of scenarios, the idea of multiple possible futures. That word scenario in future studies actually comes from a word we get from the movies, the word scene. You know, that there is a scene with a number of actors, they interact, and there is tension, and there are various possibilities for where the scene might go. In the same way that the scenarios that confront senior decision makers may lead to various outcomes. So that's just something on the overall approach and the overall thinking that went into the book, Volney. But I have to say, I'm a what is sometimes called a pracademic. You know, one foot in the academic world, one foot in the world of practice, because I work around the world with real executives, with real P&Ls. You know, lots of pressure from shareholders, lots of pressure from activists in the society, activists on the planet, their own internal activists in terms of their talent. So I attempted in the book to offer, you know, frameworks, but not just theory, you know, something that you can actually use in practice also. So then to come to your first question then of the systemic leadership learning, and you've highlighted some of the great authors who have already done this work. In the same way that in a scene in a movie, you would have various characters in the scene, developing that scene and exploring it. I've also linked systems thinking then to various other modalities of thinking, including only elements of creative thinking, of analytical thinking, of design thinking that's become very popular, of effectual thinking, the way that entrepreneurs think, and one of my favorite subjects, futures thinking. So systems thinking, creative thinking, effectual thinking, design thinking, and then futures thinking, to create a sort of bouquet of intellectual skills for leaders that they can tap into. And the book provides, in many cases, a kind of step-by-step guide. So beyond just saying to people, oh, you know, it's important to think about the future, there's a step-by-step guide that explains how some of that futures thinking may be conducted. And similarly, you know, as you correctly said, Sengi did such amazing work to encourage a systemic approach. I offer in the book, Volney, a step-by-step guide on how could you think systemically. What does that mean to think in interconnected ways, and then to link them together? How does the interconnectedness present the future? And then I'm talking an awful lot, Volney, but behind all of that, for example, are things like paradigms, things that became famous in the 1970s. Paradigms are essentially just patterns of thinking. And so I develop a kind of classification system for how we think about paradigms. Why is this so important, Phil? Because let us just look at the current clash of paradigms between, let's say, American Republicans and American Democrats. The paradigm of Zelensky versus the paradigm of Putin. The paradigm of Xi Jinping versus the paradigm of Donald Trump. The paradigm of NATO versus the paradigm now of, well, it seems Trump is also in competition, but the paradigm of Putin again. So we have a sort of global level clash of paradigms, and I thought it might be useful, beyond just saying to people, oh, we must remember we come from different paradigms. What does that mean? How could you actually understand it? And then I'll conclude this first section, Rolling. Most executives are not trained on any of this. If they went to business school, you know, they would have generally been exposed to the classics, and they need it. It's important. They need to learn operations, human resources, you know, typical strategy, law, finance. It's all very important. But that kind of classical business school education, I think, must be revisited as we become now towards the end of the first quarter of the 21st century.
For sure, for sure. One thing that I mean, it's key, and I think you stressed very strongly in the beginning, is that the leader of today, of 2025, has the responsibility of calling for himself a new leadership role which
Yes.
cannot be outsourced. It cannot be delegated. It cannot
Yeah.
be put aside and make him feel at ease, rested. Oh,
Yeah.
I've dealt with that. No,
Yeah.
it's not like that. It's different. I mean, if you don't embrace the responsibility of the learning yourself, of
Yes.
reinventing yourself as a leader, the leader of 2025, of the now getting into the second quarter of the century, from 25 to 49 to 50. I mean,
Yes.
if you don't embrace responsibility of doing the learning, you as a leader, doing the learning, doing the flexibility, doing the adaptability of this new chaotic world. And and I will stress the importance you put in the subtitle, the madness of becoming a
Yeah.
leader of today. So, man, wake up. You are in a role of madness, and of course it's not a loose cannon
Yeah.
madness. There is, although the chaos, there is order, there is
Yes.
growth, there is fruits, there is generative possibilities. But uh, I would like to hear you from this, the madness and the
Yeah.
importance of the leader to uh, be the number one step, or the first step in the transformation of the organization in this time of today.
Fantastic, Ronnie. I just love the way that you've set the scene there. Um, and you're right. There is madness, sort of chaos, and there is also order. And so we sometimes refer to it as K-ord, occasional order, especially if you look at it in a very micro sense. But if you look a little bit more broadly, it seems a little bit chaotic. So you then highlighted so beautifully, Volney, the importance of agility. Now, my curiosity lies in intellectual agility, mental agility. And so, we've all been, Volney, in those conference centers where the big CEO says, in this organization, what we need is new thinking, new thinking. And everybody says, yeah, fantastic. We agree. That's why he's earning the big money. Round of applause. Then you go back to your desk and you answer emails and you write presentations and you do spreadsheets. And next quarter, you're back in the conference venue and he says, new thinking. Everyone agrees. No one knows what the hell he's talking about. So I became really interested in this kind of new thinking, intellectual agility. And so I argue that you can have new thinking by developing three broad areas, if we stand back. And that is the content of your thinking, the level of your thinking, and the methodology of your thinking. The content, the level, and the method. And the book is largely about the last two. How can I raise the level of my thinking to be more strategic? And then how can I be more agile by developing these various methods of thinking, including the ones I've mentioned? Um, and perhaps I left out strategic thinking. So systems thinking, analytical thinking, entrepreneurial thinking, design thinking, creative thinking, future thinking, and strategic thinking. Now, if you were able to develop that intellectual agility, in addition to the other forms of agility you might need, like emotional agility and so on, you will be able at least to respond to some of the madness, the chaos that you're facing, because otherwise you're just following the same path. And we've all heard from Einstein, the problems we have are the result of our current ways of thinking, and therefore, if the same kinds of thinking are perpetuated, the same kind of problems will be perpetuated. So these different kinds of thinking with an understanding of paradigms will help with that kind of agility. One way of understanding that is what the book offers in terms of frameworks is what I've called the wards of thinking. Now, only in English, the word ward is an interesting word. It refers to a sort of area or a space. And this is important because leaders think the intellectual processing is in terms of certain focus areas, focus wards. And what you need for what you've described in a semi-chaotic world is you need a broadening of those wards. Now, what's interesting is in English, the word ward is also often associated with, something that people go to for recovery. So, for example, you'll talk about the psychiatric ward in a hospital,
Yes,
or
yes,
the medical ward or something like that. So I played with that in English a little bit, and just to stimulate and even provoke senior people to think about this concept of wards or regions of thinking. So I played with the idea of backward. Now, of course, I'm being deliberate here in the pronunciation. Backward. So if you're thinking backward, for example, you want to revert to some time that your nostalgia thinks was magical. For example, you want to make things great again. That is a backward way of thinking about the world.
yes.
And of course, the viable alternative is forward, the future, exploring the future and what that might bring. So I play with backward, forward. I also play with inward and outward. So inward, we see this, for example, in what you might call American exceptionalism, or this kind of American inwardly focused orientation, the view that American consumers can save America. We all know that's absolute nonsense. We're in a global economy, but we still see leaders around the world thinking inwardly. A viable alternative is to think outwardly. Then you can also think about downward and upward. And as you go down, you get into highly operational work, to-do lists and tasks and activities and processes. And we know that we need leaders who are now able to think upward into higher levels of thinking and decision-making, beyond tactics to strategic thinking and futures thinking. And then there are two others that I played with, and that is wayward, just creative thinking, and my personal favorite, and now I'm just being silly, Volney, awkward. In other words,
yeah.
awkward thinking,
Yeah, fantastic,
almost
fantastic.
awkwardizing the problem so that you can come at it from a new perspective. And these kinds of playful approaches to the mind might help us to respond to this hyper-complex environment executives are in.
I putting into subtitles for Portuguese, I will have it will be awkward, literally, because of course it sounds very nice and appropriate, and we may have to use some analogy.
You're
But
right.
but you are right. As we talked about awkward madness just minutes ago, when you go into the awkward, you're really going into the messy room, the place
Yes.
where there's confusion,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
it's fantastic. As you have jumped into the part of the book that you bring in the Sodicast framework,
Yes. Yes.
please explain a bit about the systems-oriented design for complex adaptive system technique. Of course, you have done that with the wards, but
Yes.
how come you elaborated this play on words and at the same time the play on the acronym SODCAST?
Yes. I'm so glad you noticed that,
Well,
Volney. And
I read the book, so I did my homework.
that's very impressive. I'll tell you in a playful way how I came up with the name of that framework, the Sodcast framework. There's a great dictionary, playful dictionary known as the Urban Dictionary. And the Urban Dictionary captures kind of real-time language as it unfolds. And what it noticed is that it responds to language needed in a modern time. And one of the sort of silly ways it did that is we all know about broadcasting, to broadcast.
Yes.
And we then had a podcast.
Mhm.
But
Which is
then
very common today.
yes, and then we have this very annoying phenomenon, Volney, where people listen to their phones in public without headphones. And in
Yes.
English, one word for an annoying person is a sod. So instead of a podcast, this is known as a sodcast. If you're an annoying person and you're watching
Yeah.
your videos out loud, so everyone has to hear it. But
Yeah.
then, so I use that word sodcast then for this acronym, systems oriented design of complex adaptive systems. Okay, so systems oriented, in other words, not parts oriented. No, so much of the business architecture is based on classical analytical thinking,
Yes.
which is
Yes.
essentially about parts. The first question in analytical thinking is what are the parts? And the value of that is that it has given us very deep knowledge. But the disadvantage is that for organizations, it has given us what you might call silositis, disjointedness, fragmentedness. It's made the world disconnected. And so what systems thinking has the power of doing is to investigate the connections. Now, whereas the first question in analytical thinking is what are the parts, in systems thinking, the first question, and this I borrowed from the great systems thinking theorist Russell Ackoff, the first question in systems thinking is not what are the parts, but what is this a part of? In other words, what system does it belong to? What is it an example of? What does it sit inside of? So when we use that principle with executives, they are often tempted to talk about the parts of their organization. And what we help them to understand is that their organization is a part of a much greater system. And the sustainability of their organization is extended when they can find meaningful connections inside that system. Volney, the word ecosystem has only been in business for the last 20 years or so,
Yeah.
even
Very,
less.
very. Yeah.
And it came out of the natural sciences, the study of ecosystems, where we began to understand, such as that beautiful ecosystem there behind you, that things are related. Yes, you can classify things based on trees and insects and birds and so on. But in reality, the birds interact with the trees, interact with the insects, interact with the soil, and so on and so on. So systems thinking is really an ecosystem perspective on business problems that can be employed at a problem level inside a division. Just listen to that language, isn't it crazy, Volney? Division. In other words, dividing into parts the areas of our business. And so what systems thinking brings is an opportunity for senior decision makers to make decisions based on a systems view about where the leverages are in terms of connections in that system. And we're just beginning to realize that this is how a business ecosystem works, And so, the example of tariffs, for example, it's a current dominant discussion, is such a good example of it. Because if you think of tariffs in an analytical way of action-reaction and, closing down systems or closing down and separating parts, then you don't understand that there's a global financial system, a social system, and a planetary system. And that system behaves like an ecosystem, not like a mechanistic part of the first industrial revolution. And so the Sodcast technique framework is a step-by-step guide that can help senior people to interrogate their problems in different ways, rather than simply finding a part that's problematic. They can examine that problem or that business unit or indeed that full enterprise inside the system. And why is that important? Because it can only be successful inside the system.
That's fantastic. And if you don't think about the company globally, when you think of the role of the leader, you have hierarchical levels, and as you said, there's divisions. This is the department, and it seems that the leader is using, the Machiavellian king's, not the principle, the king's way of leading. Divide so you can rule. Put people between you and the soldiers so that you are protected. But this is not the way. When you say system globally, you have to abandon the Cartesian way of linearly thinking and doing and processing change into a more systemic and broad involvement of all, beginning with the leader.
That's exactly correct. And you make a great point about separation, because in analytical thinking, analysis is often concerned with separation. We would often say, let's separate these issues out. Now, it has a place in a small perspective of problems. But separation is a fascinating idea. I mean, think about the role of the customer. CEOs are always talking about customers, but organizations are often decided or designed in such a way that the more senior you become, the greater the distance between you and the customer. Isn't that crazy? So you call yourself a customer-centric organization, but the reward for a promotion, maybe with the exception of corporate investment banking, is that you no longer have to talk to the customer. Customers are typically served by the lowest paid, least experienced people in the business. And so, you make a very interesting point about that idea of separation. So this is then what the book does, Volney, to take a deep dive into these thinking methodologies like systems thinking that we've looked at now. It does the same with the other methodologies, like strategic thinking. Every senior executive who goes to an interview is asked, do you consider yourself a strategic thinker? And of course, the executive would say, yes, very much so, extremely strategic. And the executive is not sure what the hell that means, But that's okay because the interviewer is not sure what the hell it means either.
Also.
So, so the book offers, it sort of says, well, what do we mean by that? You know, you're strategic. And so, I mean, I'll give just a taster from that section of the book. So it helps organize it. And again, Volney, this is not a critique of executives. It's a way of helping them to deal with that complexity. So, for example, in strategic thinking, there's a model we use called the Income Prescripts 5I framework, which looks at a whole host of dimensions. But that's for greater detail. We start by helping executives to understand that the first step, if you're asking about first steps, Volney, is to take a full enterprise perspective. Now, you might think, gosh, that's obvious. But in reality, even senior executives are looking at their business division. And they come and sit around the boardroom and they report on activity in their division. Of course, that's a useful part of the operating reporting model, but it's not sufficient when the business is trying to be holistic. So firstly, a full enterprise perspective for strategic thinking. Then the real difference is to link the internal tactical work of the organization with the external contextual development of the environment, the system in which it's in. And now you can see the overlap between systems thinking and strategic thinking. So a full enterprise perspective in which you link the internal tactical development of the organization with the external contextual development. And then you do that through a set of choices. We're talking about decision making, a set of choices that are integrated. You're doing that in a game of your choice. Why is it a game? Because everyone, including your competitors, have the same rules, but you can play it differently. You do that on a competitive landscape. I work with so many clients, Volney, who think that they're so special and different that they don't have competitors. And you do that in a way that increases the probability of winning.
Yep.
So a full enterprise perspective, linking the internal tactical with the external contextual through an integrated set of choices in a game of your choice on a competitive landscape that increases the probability of winning. And we find even when we say that to very senior executives around the world, and I do this, as you know, in Europe, and I'm in the rest of Africa and the Middle East, even for senior executives, many of them say, we are in strategy sessions all the time. And we never really think about what is strategic thinking in the first place. What we generally do is we take last year, we want to add 8%, and we want to cut costs by 5%. That's our default mode.
If that is a strategy, we wouldn't have so much of a problem to go into the future.
Yeah, exactly.
One important thing that I must stress, which you emphasize on the book, is that the leader, when he looks at the future, he's not doing a theoretical exercise per se. He's going much more into the practical and more real life and real world, as you put out, of the competition, where you have to emphasize new things, creative things, innovation. And how do you deal with the, let's say that the leader has a wrong perception and understanding of when you tell them you have to think about the future. I said, no,
Yeah.
that's the theory. I don't wanna. That's poetry. By the way, afterwards, I want to talk about Robert Frost because
Yes.
you have intertwined his poems all over the pages of your book, and it's just it not only enriches, but it brings light and light in terms of new perspective, but at the same time freshness. A new air where you can breathe. But please, first of all, how to deal with leaders who have this misconception about
Yeah.
futures being something theoretical and
Yes.
not
It's
practical, not.
such it's such an important question that you ask. So, and you're right, we face this all the time, this kind of suspicion of the future. But I have to say, Volney, when we spend time with executives and we have these discussions like you and I are having now, they do come around. They do realize the importance of this. So we help them to understand that a few things. The first is that, they will often say, well, that's just an idea. And we help them to understand that everything starts with an idea. This pen in my hand, this lip gloss, this book, this phone, that bright shirt of yours, your glasses, everything, your entire product line, your entire organizational structure, all of it, the chair you're sitting on, the desk you're writing on, started with an idea. So, in this way, we try to make leaders a little bit more comfortable with the abstract, not for the sake of theory, but to help them to understand that every single competitive differentiation started in the abstract. Of course, it becomes real later. In the same way, the future starts in the abstract and becomes very real very quickly. So, we say it to them in language that they understand. Do you think it will be beneficial if you could see the risk before your competitor does? Do you think it would be beneficial if you can sense the opportunity in the market before the competitor does? Do you think it would be useful if you could anticipate the direction of the regulatory environment? And then they all say, well, of course it would be. I could start working on that now. I could start protecting myself. I could start designing myself for where the future's going. And suddenly they realize the past, as powerful as it is, seduces us because it's tangible. But the past is the one place we will never visit again. And every risk and every opportunity can only be found in one place, and that's the future. So you might as well study the place that you're going to. We just call that the future.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
Thank you.
so we help the senior guys to understand, look, the future is going to happen anyway, whether you do futures thinking or not. It's happening anyway. And you have to understand that these methods, sometimes they say, gosh, Dr. Mostert, these things, they sound so complicated. Oh, okay. But you have to understand. I often give them this analogy, if you're driving from Sao Paulo to Rio de Janeiro, and on the road there, you know that there's an area in the countryside where animals cross the road, such as cattle, for example. Now you're driving your car there in the middle of the night and you switch on your lights and you see the cattle on the road. Now it's very important to understand the lights did not make the cattle.
That's
They
right.
were there anyway.
Anyway, yeah.
Now, you can switch off your lights if you want, and you can pretend there aren't really risks on the road. You can do that, but now you are exposing yourself, your talent, your investors, even your planet and your society to enormous risk because you're refusing to look at the future. So methods like transdisciplinary scanning, like the development of scenarios, all they do is they switch on the lights. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it anymore. And you come back to today, and yes, then you make practical decisions. Then you make practical decisions that you can hedge your risk of the future, and you can start to design yourself towards the emerging opportunities presented by the future.
Mhm. Fantastic, fantastic. You know, there's the fable of the ant and the grasshopper. And I don't know if my microphone is picking up, but in Portuguese, the fable is translated the cicade, the cicad, and
Yeah.
the ant. And
Ah,
is that how you pronounce cicad or
yeah,
cicade?
cycad, yes. Yeah,
Cycad,
yeah.
cycad. So the cycads are singing around this nice environment,
Beautiful.
because it's summertime here down south, and everything is fine. And if you look at the ground, you will see a lot of ants working. So
Ah,
the of course, to introduce future thinking, the fable is so appropriate because
yeah,
winter is coming. You have to prepare yourself for winter. But
that's right.
it's really interest because I'm hearing since the early morning the cycads singing around us. Uh,
Beautiful.
let's go into Robert Frost, and
Yes.
then as you had shown me in the past video, some of the South African scenery in the South Atlantic. I will
Yeah.
show you some of the scenery before we say goodbye. But let's go into Robert Frost. How come? I mean, I think it was fantastic. Were you fond of Robert Frost? What was
Yes.
the reason you have enriched your text with Robert Frost's poems?
Thank you, Volney. Yes, when I was a young man, filled with optimism and romanticism, I wanted to study literature, and my father said, "No, no, law and business. That's the direction you're going to take." So, but I've kept that curiosity alive, and so I have a keen interest in poetry. I've also published a collection of poems, and the reason I'm so fascinated by poetry is that it is playful with language, and language matters. Language matters. And what is so amazing about the art of poetry is, firstly, it is an art form. And that brings us, Volney, into the importance of a creative thinking capacity for senior people. Every business person, if you say to them, do you think innovation is important? They say yes. But if you ask them, do you think art is important? They go, well, I don't know. I'm sort of in business. Well, art is produced with creative thinking. And poetry is an art form. And why particularly Robert Frost? Well, Frost was this American poet, and he had this fascinating philosophy that, as many artists do, as many organizations do, they feel themselves a little bit separated from the rest. Okay, now and yet they have to they understand they have to engage with the rest. So one of the psychological characteristics of Robert Frost is that he often saw himself sort of up against a challenge, and then he went through this intellectual process of saying, well, could it be this way? Could it be that way? What about this? I'm discovering so much. I'm realizing my own ignorance. And the where I am now with the sense making, to come back to your word in your introduction, where I am now with my sense making as a thinker. And then he would often conclude in these beautiful rhyming couplets towards the end of the poem. And you know, one of his poems, of course, made famous by that well-known film, you know, which was the Dead Poets Society.
Oh, yes, yes, with
Quoted,
Robin
of course,
Williams.
Robert Frost, and for strategists, it was such an
Yes,
important reminder of the link between strategic thinking and poetry. When Frost said, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by." In other words, the creative option.
yes.
And that has made all the difference. And
All the
so as a young man, I fell in love with the way that Robert Frost engages with the complexity of life. And you're right, and I frequently quote Frost. So you can see interwoven with the movie titles, which are also
yes,
creative. You then
yes,
have the kind of Robert Frost quotation from his poetry in almost every chapter. And so my hope is that executives will be stimulated by that they would understand that creative thinking is not just something for artists, it's something for the executive. And in fact, Volney, I would go as far as to say something like creative thinking is now no longer optional. It is a matter now of survival of your
imperative.
organization. It is imperative for the flourishing of your organization and of the society and of the planet.
Fantastic, fantastic. So many things to dive into and to go deeper. We should think of a second conversation. I
Ah.
will elaborate more. It's a pity. I mean, of course, you just put out in English, but it's a pity. We have to work uh, quickly to put into Portuguese and have it to the Brazilian market because
I would love it.
it's as I felt it's really so rich of possibilities and you can choose different ways to deal
Mhm.
with a problem and to go into so you I think you mastered this uh, uh, framework of really going more deep into the corporate culture and change it, starting by the
Mm.
leaders. So I think it's a must read, a must read. I'm sorry, it's a must read for all kinds of executives, not only in the corporate world, but those that have leadership roles in organizations, be it nonprofit and political realms and so on.
Thank
I
you
really,
so much, Volney, for those kind words. It's always a tremendous pleasure talking to you. You have such a deep curiosity, and again, you know, on behalf of us who work in the research and the authoring environment, our gratitude to you for bringing these ideas to the world.
oh, you're welcome. Let's as we say goodbye, let me show you some of the scenery that we have
Ah.
here because we're high in the mountain. I don't know, the clouds have uh, uh, do not help much, but there's the mountains here, you know. We're high
Yeah.
on the 1400 meters, uh,
Gosh,
and this is this is part of the scenery, as you say, you know.
beautiful.
And
Yes.
there's a solar park there. I don't know if
Aha.
we can see it.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
the poles are to see the sunset as the extremes of the winter and the summer, the solstice, and
Aha.
there's a sun clock. How you say sun?
Yes.
Uh, a
Sundial. Yes.
yeah, where you can see the by the shade you will see the hour of the day.
Oh,
So
wow.
so it was really a pleasure, Morne, to have you and to talk. And I mean, so enriching, not only your book, but the time we spent together. And let's try to be again and work out something for the Brazilian market also.
I would love that, Volney, and thank you for concluding our corporate conversation by showing us the beauty of nature. And these two have to work together. I loved
Yeah,
it. Thanks so much.
yeah. Okay. Nice to have you. Thank you, Morne.
Thank you. Take care.